the World Trade Organization, where the appellate body is comparatively dysfunctional, the WHO, which played an important role as far as the pandemic is concerned. Right now you are recognizing that there is a nation state which is having sovereignty. So in the pre-Westphalian world order, there was no such concept of the state sovereignty. Regarding the world war, that when the state is having any kind of issue in dealing with other state, only one solution that was available generally with that state is to go for a war. The multilateralism is facing the multiplicity of the crisis, right? International Solar Alliance, Coalition for Disaster Resilience Infrastructure. These are the proof that India is doing a lot at the global fora. Similarly, when you talk about the United Nations reforms, specifically in UNSC, there have been the rigid structure that more than 5 permanent member aaj tak nahi bane hain, right? Hello everyone, I am Vishal Sir, and today we are going to discuss a very interesting and the important topic from the perspective of international relations, which is the crisis or reforms, the future of multilateralism in the 21st century. Now, in the past decades, we have seen a lot of issues that are questioning that whether the world is still being governed by multilateralism, or is there any kind of shift that has been observed with respect to the decline of multilateralism. And why I am saying so? Because there have been recently certain issues. So if we start from the perspective of trade, there have been issues regarding the tariff which is being sanctioned by the United States of America. Apart from that, the World Trade Organization, where the appellate body is comparatively dysfunctional. The next, if we talk about the crisis as far as the global governance and the wars are concerned, in that particular front, there have been Israel and the Iran war that we have recently seen, the crisis that is going on between Russia and Ukraine, and where are the multilateral organization in this specific context. When we talk about the economic governance, whether it is the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, are they specifically representing the present realities? The WHO, which played an important role as far as the pandemic is concerned, but then there have been the vaccine nationalization and many such other issues that had happened simultaneously. In all these circumstances, cannot we question that whether there is still the relevance of multilateralism that is there, or is there any need for reform as far as the multilateralism is concerned? So all these questions we are going to address in this specific discussion of today. Now, when we are talking about the crisis or reform as far as the multilateralism is concerned, first of all, in order to understand this entire scenario, we should be having a clear idea regarding what is the world order or what is the global order. Now, why we have to talk about the global order? Because this is the global order which talks about that how the powers are arranged or how systematically arranged powers are as far as the global organizations are concerned. Now, here the organization is not necessarily any type of institution, but it is just the arrangement of power as far as their powers in different domains are concerned. So when we talk about the evolution of the global order, it can be divided into multiple phases. I have, for the convenience, divided into 5 phases, which can be considered as the evolution of the global order. Now, the first phase, when we talk about, is the pre-Westphalian phase. Now, what is the pre-Westphalian world order or the pre-Westphalian phase? It is before the Treaty of Westphalia, which was in 1648, which resulted into, like, the treaty ka precursor was that there were multiple wars that were going on in the Europe and specifically within the Roman Empire. Now, in that particular case, what was happening? That here in this particular world order, there was no such one specific major organization or any specific organization which was having all the powers. So, for example, right now you are recognizing that there is a nation state which is having sovereignty. So, in the pre-Westphalian world order, there was no such concept of the state sovereignty. There were certain feudal lords. These feudal lords were having the governance in their own reign. Now, there were certain religious authorities Now, these religious authorities, like for example, Pope, who was representing the church and representing the religious institutions. Now, sometimes what was happening that even feudal lords were giving recognition to these religious authorities. Sometimes the religious authorities are doing certain kind of interference in their governance. So it was not the system like where the state is supreme. And above that, there is also the empire. But this empire was a loose construct at that point of time, because the empire was also dependent on these feudal lords along with the regional authorities or the religious authorities, basically in order to ensure the legitimacy. So it was not known that who is the governing authority in this particular context. Now, when we are talking about that, we do not know that who is the ultimate authority. In that particular case, it is no such kind of specific one authority which is governing all the affairs. That's why the powers were distributed. And that's why in the pre-Westphalian world order, it was not the concept of sovereignty which defined the arrangement of power. That's why it led to the situation of chaos. And when the world, and specifically the European world, was fighting at that point of time, in order to provide certain order, there was the Treaty of Westphalia that was signed in 1648, which led to the peace. And ultimately, as a product of that particular Treaty of Westphalia, there were certain concepts that were recognized in this sense. There was the concept of nation state that emerged after it. This particular nation state was also having the concept of sovereignty. That means for all the affairs, whether it is internal or the external, now the nation state is supreme in order to conduct their own affairs. That's why at the international level, there were multiple powers that is created, but now this power for their internal as well as for the external affairs, that power is supreme. So there is no such kind of thing like there are feudal lords within that, the religious authorities and the empire that might be there. But ultimately, who is controlling these particular states governed by the sovereignty? It is the particular nation state which is governing their own affairs. And this gave rise to the development in these particular nation state, specifically in the European region. Now, when the state progressed, there was a development of the state from the economic perspective, political perspective, and many other perspectives that had seen the technological advancement also in the form of industrial revolution. But then there was again the crisis period initiated, because when these particular powers were having sovereignty and there was no such cooperation that was going on between these particular power, except a few instances, that led to the conflict between these two powers and multiplicity of the powers. Ultimately, that led to the conflict at the global level in the form of World War I and the World War II. So from the time period of 1914 to 1918 and later on 1939 to 1945, the world has observed two world wars. Now, once the world war was there, there was a lot of devastation. Why that world war was there? One such issue that was observed regarding the world war, that when the state is having any kind of issue in dealing with other state, only one solution that was available generally with that state is to go for a war. So whether any kind of miscommunication was there or any other conflict that emerged between two states, or even if there is an issue of the balance of power, that means one state is increasing power, that was considered by the other state as the threat to that. And in that sense, what they were doing, they were also increasing their own power, and that ultimately reflected into the conflict situation. Now, once the World War I and World War II had happened, now the world has seen rise of certain new organizations, which was in the form of the organizations like United Nations, the organizations like for economic governance, IMF and World Bank. Then for the trade-related negotiations also, there were certain other organizations. So entirely, there were multiple organizations that were created in order to ensure that if there is any conflict between two states, these conflicts can be resolved through the discussion, dialogue, so that the states can cooperate with each other. There should be minimization of the conflict between the state. But simultaneously, when we talk about the world order becomes the bipolar polar. Why? Because after the World War II, there was emergence of the two major power or two major ideologies. The one ideology that was being governed by the United States, which was the ideology of the capitalism, and the states which allied themselves with the United States were the capitalistic states. So one bloc was created in the form of United States. This was the one pole. Another pole which was created after the World War II, which was the USSR, which was basically based upon the socialist or the communist ideology. Now, the states which allied themselves with the USSR, they were of the socialist ideology. Now, this particular was the world order which was having the two poles at the international level, and that governed the world roughly from the time period of the World War II to the time period of the end of Cold War. Because in 1991, once the Cold War was ended, it ended with the disintegration or the dissolution of the USSR. Now, once out of these two poles, one pole is not in existence. There is only one pole is going to remain. So once the Cold War was ended, there was a unipolar world order that was observed. Now just try to assume a scenario that there is a sports. In that sports, there is only one team which is having all the rights available. It is having all the kind of immunities available. And all the other teams which are playing in that particular tournament, that teams does not have any kind of right. Their appeals are not going to be heard. In that case, don't you think so that particular system is going to be unfair? This has happened in the unipolar world order. When the world order became unipolar, the United States was the only major pole, because at this point, at this juncture, it was the sole superpower that was available. Other superpower which was in existence till 1991, now that power vanishes, right? So from 1991 to roughly 2001, we can say the world has witnessed the unipolarity, where only one major power which was there. Now you might think that what about other powers like India, China? They were in the growing phase. They were not putting or posing direct challenge to the United States at this point of time. Not India, not China, neither any European countries posing any direct threat or direct confrontation to the United States at this point of time. But then what happened? There was 9/11 attack that shook the world, and also that told to the United States that you are also not immune from any of the terrorist attack. That gives a major blow to the major power, which is the most significant power at that point of time, and that led to the shed of this particular myth. And after that, there was simultaneous rise of multiple powers. There was rise of China, both on the economic front and also on the strategic front, like the military and all. There was simultaneous emergence of Russia as an outproduct or the successor of the USSR. There was rise of India also as a major power, which is representing the IT and many other fields, right? The workforce, the market that India is representing. And simultaneously, there were multiple other powers. So when this particular unipolarity was shed, at this juncture, the world has witnessed the world order which is of multiple poles. That means it's like that there is no only single pole. Yes, there may be multiple pole of different size, but all are having their own relevance. But what is difference between this and the Westphalian world order? That here there was no such kind of international organization in order to make them collaborate, in order to ensure them that they have the communication channel available. And simultaneously, after the unipolar world order, we have observed that there has been rise of globalization. So by this time, countries are aware that when they are going to cooperate, they can get comparatively better benefit, because each country represents the amount of market also. And these countries can access the other countries' market because the kind of border that is there between the states is not the solid border, it is now the porous border. That's why this led to the development of the multipolar world order. Now, presently, when recently, 2-3 days back, when the External Affairs Minister of India, Dr. S. Jaishankar, highlighted that the United Nations system is falling in the crisis. It is not playing any decisive role in all the global concerns or the crisis that the world is facing. whether it is resolution of any conflict that is going on or reform at the institution itself, that highlights that there is an urgent need in order to resolve this particular multilateral institution. So here I have utilized two terms. One is the multipolar global order and the crisis in that. And the next term I have talked about is the multilateralism. Now, what is the difference between these two? So when we are talking about the multipolar world order, that means there is simultaneous emergence of multiple power. There is no only one country which is having powers available. There are multiple countering powers also which are giving certain sense of competition to the other power. That means there are presence of multiple powers of different size. Now, when we are talking about the multilateralism, multilateralism is simply the concept that depicts that there are certain common problems. When there are certain common problems that no only single state is able to solve, that means it's like a sports where you will need a team, where you will need cooperation of multiple actors. So in the case of multilateralism, it is considered that when the three or more countries comes together, they cooperate in order to resolve the common problem that these countries are facing, that can be termed as the multilateralism. It is contrary to the unilateralism, which is like one country is dictating everything, that is making all the rules, that is making all the kind of resolution of any specific issue. Or the bilateralism where two countries, maybe the India, US, maybe India, Russia, are cooperating in order to resolve the dispute. But in the case of multilateralism, it is being faced, the issue is being faced by multiple countries. Generally, the number of countries is 3+. The common problem is there. And apart from that, not a single state is able to solve the entire problem. And then there is a need for multiple actors. For example, let's say talk about the terrorism. Is only one state able to counter the issues regarding terrorism? Even the largest of the large states is not able to counter the terrorist attack posed on them. Whenever we talk about cross-border terrorism, it's not about only India, Pakistan. There are multiple states where this kind of cross-border terrorism issue is going on. When we are talking about the economic governance, it's not only that whether India or whether it is China or whether it is any other country which is facing the economic issues. Entire region of global south is facing the discrimination from the Western order that was established after 1945. That says that it's not only one country that can solve all the problems available. That's why when the problem is being by multiple countries, the resolution is also found out by cooperation between these particular countries. And this is what we mean by the multilateralism. So for example, when you talk about the United Nations system, or you talk about World Bank, or in the context of health, you talk about WHO, or you talk about Financial Action Task Force for the money laundering, black money related things, or you talk about the World Trade Organization for the trade related aspects, or you talk about IMF for the monetary related support in the case of the balance of payment crisis, right? In the context of climate change, it's the Paris Agreement. So when we are talking about these organizations, these represents the institutions of the multilateralism, where these organizations are giving representation to multiple countries. But are these organizations fair? Are these organizations having relevance that was available when these organizations were formed out? And that's the major question, that whether multilateralism is intact today or multilateralism is facing issue, as being highlighted by multiple political analysts and the state leaders also, right? Now, when we are talking, we have already discussed about the multilateralism. We have to also talk about why we are so much emphasizing upon this particular concept, why at least there is some kind of focus that has to be given on the multilateralism, why that is important. So when we are talking about why multilateralism is an important construct, we have to understand it from the multiple perspective. First, from the global peace and security. Now, I have given you certain example, whether it is the countering of terrorism, whether it is dealing the situations like piracy, whether it is addressing the issue between multi-nation conflict, all these things needs the support from the collaboration or the collaboration of multiple states that comes together and that supports each other in order to resolve this. So in order to ensure the peace and security across the globe, there is importance of multilateralism, because without this, what you are going to face, you are going to face the situation of anarchy, jahan par there will be different states which are about to bite each other, because the state ka basic nature is to increase its own power at the pretext of the other power. And this is the state of nature that will be available. If there is no multilateralism, then the world is going to go for the destruction of the peace. Each and every country will go again back to that situation jahan par there is the state of anarchy. Next is addressing the emerging global challenges. Now, these are also the global challenges, but apart from that also there are multiple challenges that the world is facing. The world is facing the climate crisis. So in the context of the climate crisis, what are these particular climate crises that are there? These particular crises includes the rise of greenhouse gases and pollutants that needs redressal of this issue and working upon solution of this particular thing. Then there is rise of the unsustainable energy resource, because the oil and natural gas that are comparatively limited, and if we are not shifting towards the sustainable sources of energy, in that particular case, world is going to face the climate crisis. The temperature is going to rise, and that is going to impact a lot of countries, and specifically those countries which are the island nation or the coastal boundary states that are going to get impacted a lot, because rise of the sea level is going to impact this. Apart from this, there are certain other challenges. For example, there is issue because of the artificial intelligence, because all the fruits of artificial intelligence is not distributed to all the countries equally. Certain countries are getting benefit because they have access to a lot of data, a lot of other things. But many such countries are getting devoid of this particular support from the side of artificial intelligence related things. There is also the issue like there have been a rise of the cyber warfare, the new kind of warfare that are being constructed now. There have been deployment of the rapid technology as far as the warfare is concerned. The space race is again going on, right? So these are the global challenges that are there, and all these challenges says that addressing these challenges needs the support from the side of multilateralism. When we talk about the economic stability, again, there are issues like tariff, from the side of countries like United States. Again, the United States propagate its own policy, which is America first. They are coming out of major organizations which were erstwhile considered as the organization supported by United States. And in this particular sense, what they are doing, they are destructing the global order that has been established. They are destructing the organization once they have created for their own benefit and also for the benefit of their allies. But now these particular organizations are being destructed when these organizations there have been reform related things are being asked by the global south countries. Apart from that, lastly, when we are talking about voice for the smaller nation, so there are groupings like there is G77, there is organization like L69. Apart from that, there is rise of the organizations like BRICS, BIMSTEC, SCO, right? When these particular organizations are emerging, they are also representing the interest of certain other parties which are not necessarily the member of these particular organization, but they are giving rise to the countries which were previously represented by the organizations like non-aligned movement or the movement like non-aligned movement, right? So in that cases, this represents that the multilateralism still holds the relevance. But again, the question comes that when we are talking about all these crises that are going on, whether related to medicine, whether related to technology, all these things are presently being faced. That means this is not properly functioning, and that's why the issues are being there with respect to the present structure of the multilateralism. Now, when we are talking about the issues that are there in multilateralism, that means the multilateralism is facing the multiplicity of the crises, right? So what are these crises that are pertaining to the multilateralism? So when we are talking about the crisis, the first and the important crisis is the geopolitical rivalry. Now, there have been rivalry between the US and China. US imposes the tariff. China says we are blocking your rare earth mineral access. Then US says, nahi, we are going to cooperate. So this shows that the arm twisting is still going on. The characters have changed, but the nature has not changed. Still, the world is moving between the countries which are holding substantial amount of power. And in between, there have been interplay between the countries like the India, the countries of the European Union, right? So there has been the geopolitical rivalries between the major power. Simultaneously, there have been the conflicts that are emerging across the globe. For example, when the US puts pressure on the countries like India in order to stop the purchase of the oil from the Russia in the pretext of the Russia-Ukraine crisis. And even Mr. Donald Trump has said in the UNGA that India and China are funding the war in the Russia against the Ukraine. Now, when the countries are saying and utilizing the platform in order to propagate their own agenda, in that particular cases, don't you think so? There is going to be a rivalry between the countries, and there will be comparatively more animosity, which otherwise could have been avoided. So this is going to create the issue. Apart from that, when we are talking about the tariff issue, and when we are talking about the secondary sanctions, these things are preventing any cooperation between the country. Otherwise, India and US could have cooperated in a better manner in order to provide the solution to the global issues, which was previously going on. But from roughly last 1 year, there have been halt as far as the cooperation is concerned in these particular front. Apart from that, US and Russia also are in conflict. There have been conflict that is evident in the context of the Russia-Ukraine crisis. So these are representing that there have been global rivalries, geopolitical rivalries that are again re-emerging because the United States is getting anxious by the rise of the countries like China, the resurgence of Russia, and the rise of India. Apart from that institutional deficit, so we have already discussed that there have been institutions like IMF. In the United Nations framework, there is UNSC. Now, when these organizations were formed, roughly 1940s mein, these organizations were representing the global order of 1940s. This was the bipolar world order, where the dominance of the USSR and the US was there. So they and their allies got the representation in these particular institutions in a comparatively better manner. But now the countries of the global south says that we want more representation because we represent market, we represent economy, we represent political power, we represent stability, and we represent the strength. But then these countries are denying because the way structures of this IMF and UNSC is being created, that UNGA में reforms बहुत मुश्किल है as far as the UNSC reforms are concerned. Until the point of time all the member or the permanent member of UNSC does not agree with the expansion of the council, it cannot be done. And no country want to give away their own power or try to share more power with the other countries because of the obvious reason. That's why on one side there is geopolitical rivalry, on the other side there is institutional deficit. Because when these institutions are not representing the present global order, which represents the economic strength of the countries like India and China, at that point of time, these institutions are not representative in nature, and that's what is highlighted by the External Affairs Minister of India in his recent UNGA remarks. When we talk about the unilateralism and protectionism, again, there have been the unilateral action. For example, in WTO, there is an appellate body. In that appellate body, 2019 onwards, there has not been any appointment of the judges which is going to resolve the dispute if that occurs in WTO. That means there is no such dispute resolution mechanism that is functioning in WTO. Now the WTO को conceptualize किया गया था in order to resolve the trade dispute, but that dispute body itself gets disputed because of the unilateralism. Why? Because US is not allowing that particular appointment, because that US thinks that that is going to contrary to the US interest. Similarly, when we are talking about the protectionism, again there has been issues that have been observed. The policies like America first. Again, there have been recently H-1B visa related changing of rules. There have been $1 lakh that have been levied now as a one-time fee with respect to the H-1B visa, which is allowed for the skilled workers. Apart from that, even there are multiple other crises. For example, there is a tariff war that is being waged. There have been crises as far as the immigration is concerned. So these are the unilateralism and the protectionism related issues that is being faced at the global order that shows the crisis of the multilateralism. Next is the legitimacy crisis. Now when we have talked about these particular bodies and major countries which are representing the global order, there is a legitimacy crisis. Because suppose karo, if organization does not change over a period of time, representing the true realities of that specific order, that will never be legitimate. For example, let's assume a scenario. If the Indian Constitution would not have recognized multiple rights under the ambit of Article 21, do you think that the Constitution of this day would be this much diverse, accommodating the diversity of the present time? Similar has to be there at the international level when we are talking about that these organizations are not representing the legitimate interest or the legitimacy of the global world. Because when the global south is claiming that we are having the majority population, when the African Union is saying that we are going to be more than 2.5 billion in a few years, do you think that we should still be just a puppet of yours? And many such leaders, including Ibrahim Traore, says that we are not allowing other powers which are trying to play with the African nations because we are the sovereigns. That means the nations of the Western world which are trying to control the resources of Africa now do not pose the legitimacy crisis in that particular region. So whether it is the organization or whether it is the nation state which is trying to extract the resources from these countries facing the legitimacy crisis, because people are now aware regarding this. And thanks to social media in this particular context. Lastly, there have been certain new frontiers. For example, again, the same thing like the climate change. Issues like artificial intelligence, cyber security. These are certain things which are the new and the emerging things, and these particular things talks about that it is need of the time in order to incorporate multiple countries. It's not the task of one country that one country can solve all. And there is a need to distribute the fruits which are available by the work of the developed country to the other countries, because it's not going to be possible without the support of the developing countries that they can get this much amount of development. So these are the broader crises that the multilateralism presently is facing. Now, when we have discussed regarding this, what are the shifts that the multilateralism itself is facing? Now, previously, the multilateralism which we had seen, that was the state-centric multilateralism, where the state was the dominant force. Now, right now, it is from the state-centric multilateralism to the multilateralism, which is the multi-stakeholder. There have been rise of NGO. There have been rise of the civil society organizations. There have been rise of the MNC, multinational cooperation that is there, right? So these are the multiple stakeholders that are there. There have been multiple ways to resolve the conflict, like the track to diplomacy, which is also very much prominent. Then next is the change, which is in the form of the institutional monoliths, which were like the individual institutions, for example, UN, WTO, which represents the global interest, to the regime complexes. For example, rather than IMF and World Bank, the countries are now going for NDB, which is the New Development Bank, which is of the BRICS, right? Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, which is led by China, and India is also a major stakeholder in this particular regard. Apart from that, there are many such initiatives, for example, Indo-Pacific Ocean Initiative, then the grouping of the Global South, reforms in G20 where the African Union has been incorporated now. So rather than the monoliths which represented the entire order, now there have been inclusion of multiple other countries. Apart from that, from the closed door diplomacy to the networked multilateralism. So for example, previously only a few countries that used to decide that what has to be done as a matter of the major issues. Now that is being done by the multiple stakeholders coming together, sitting. There have been discussion about the proceedings, and those things are leading into the better resolution of the dispute. So from the closed diplomacy like the 1.0, which between states, now it is going on between the businesses, between the civil society organization, between even the major powerhouses, right? And this particular case that is giving more representation even to the masses. Now, having discussed entirely about the multilateralism and the challenges faced and the shift as far as the multilateralism is concerned, what is the role that India is playing or India can play? So there have been certain historical role that India has played as far as the multilateralism is concerned. So when we are talking about the India's role, India was one such country which was upholder of the multilateralism. India supported the formation of the United Nations, and specifically the United Nations peacekeeping forces and the deployment in the peacekeeping forces in order to resolve the dispute. India even supported the resolution of the Korean Peninsula dispute. India even supported the Vietnam War related dispute resolution. So India was supporter of the global peace. Then simultaneously India led to formation of the non-aligned movement that led to ultimately creation of the third world order, which is other than the bipolar world. It is giving the representation to those countries which are otherwise not having any kind of representation, and the countries now have the third way in order to not join any organizations but getting the representation at the global fora and contributing a lot to the global progress simultaneously. Even as far as the conflict resolution is concerned, India was one such country that have given recognition to the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, one such, the non-Arab nation state which have given the legitimacy to the Palestine Liberation Organization in order to resolve the Israel-Palestine issue, which is still pertaining a major issue. Right. So these are certain things India had done. And apart from that, India was always supporter of the disarmament. India was always supporter of the nuclear non-proliferation. But at the equal level, it should not be that only 5 countries can possess the nuclear arms and not the other. This kind of discrimination should not be there. What contemporary role India plays presently, whether it is in the form of the economic domain, India talks about the reform at the IMF and World Bank in order to remove the Western biases. India talks about the UN reform or the political reform, representation in the United Nations Security Council, not only for India itself, but also for the countries or the world which is not getting representation. For example, Latin America, for example, Africa. India wants through the G4 and multiple other global forum, India is supporting the reform within the United Nations Security Council. Even as far as the reform is concerned, in the present realities, India is supporting the reform as far as the artificial intelligence, cyber physical system, cyber security, the climate crisis. Even apart from that, India is supporting the world countries, specifically the developing countries, by sharing the best practices and also through the HADR, through the humanitarian assistance and the disaster relief. Apart from that, whether you talk about the sustainable energy or dispute resolution, India is supporting. For example, International Solar Alliance, Coalition for Disaster Resilience Infrastructure. These are the proof that India is doing a lot at the global fora, but still not able to get that much recognition because the world order is still tilted towards the Western countries, and these countries are having the major positions. For example, in IMF, if you talk about, more than 40% of the voting rights are being in the control of the Western European countries and the United States. Similarly, when you talk about the United Nations reforms, specifically in UNSC, there have been the rigid structure that more than 5 permanent member aaj tak nahi bane hain. Right, and there are 10 non-permanent member, and there have been reforms that are being talked about since 1990s, but still this particular organization is devoid of any specific reform. So when we are focusing a lot, when we are contributing a lot, whether it is sustainable development goal or whether it is any other kind of global collaboration, India is still not getting its due from the world countries, despite contributing significantly to the multilateral global order and specifically in the context of multilateralism, right? So these are the India's historical role and the contemporary role that India is playing. Also, it was only in India where the image had been used, 2020 India ka G20 summit, only here the African Union got the permanent membership of G20. That also reflects India's support. India is also hosting the Voice of Global South Summit, where India is representing the interest of the Global South countries, whether digital collaboration with Africa, supporting Africa and the other countries through digital public infrastructure, like in the form of UPI and other instruments. All these things is supporting that India has all the credentials available in order to be at the better position at the global level, and specifically the reforms within the major organization, right? Now, lastly, having discussed about even India's role, now in the end, we have to talk about then when we are accepting that the world order is in crisis, there have been even the crisis in the multilateralism. So how this crisis has to be resolved? See, one thing we are very sure that despite being an observation that world is going towards the deglobalization, the globalization and the multilateralism is the need of the time, because many such issues are emerging and they will keep on emerging at the global level where there are conflict or the issues. But in that case, what can be the future of multilateralism? Because already it is there in crisis. So in the context of that, there can be a hybrid model that can be talked about. This hybrid model has the global organizations. Global organizations represents the organizations like EU, United Nations, IMF, and many other organizations. Apart from that, there has to be certain minilaterals. For example, there is Quad, there is I2U2. So on the need based, there has to be formation of these particular organizations also, which can be considered as minilateral, which is the miniature version of the multilateral organization, where the specific, those countries which are sharing the similar kind of thought process for addressing that issue concerned are cooperating in order to resolve that dispute. So going forward, the world is going to be governed in this way, where the global organization will be there, and apart from that, minilateral. If these are not going to get reformed, this can become irrelevant in future, and then ultimately there will be more prevalence of the minilateral or the regional organization. So next is regionalism. Already we have talked about the European Union. There is also ASEAN. There are other organizations. For example, there is BRICS, which is not necessarily a regional organization, but that is representing to some extent the global south countries and the emerging countries in that particular context, and talking about the reforms at the global level. Next is the rising global south. So the leadership is being taken by certain countries like India, to some extent by China also, in order to represent that particular country. China, through its BRI project, is giving the financial assistance, providing the alternative to the major global institutions. India, through its capacity building approach, collaboration with the third country in the form of triangular cooperation. India is also supporting different countries, even in African countries and the other Caribbean countries. India is having too much legitimacy. That also reflects that the India's credentials are better, and apart from that, India represents a major role in the global south. So there is Voice of Global South Summit that have been again recently held a few months back, that represents the interest of different global south countries towards the common future. Lastly, the India's opportunity, because when we are talking about the things from the India's perspective and the examination that you are going to appear for, which is the UPSC examination or any other examination if you are preparing for, generally the perspective of India, that what are the opportunities that are available in front of India. So India's opportunity as far as the future of multilateralism is concerned are also important, because see, when you talk about the unipolar world order or the bipolar world order or unilateralism or bilateralism, that is not helping to all the countries, and specifically to the emerging countries like India. In the case of there is a need for the reform and the future of multilateralism, the India has a significant opportunity, because if we are talking about, let's say, the artificial intelligence, if we are talking about the climate governance, if we are talking about the sustainable development goal, if we are talking about the technology, if we are talking about the human resources, if we are talking about the other things, everywhere India is having significant steps that India has already taken. Now, there is a need to accelerate that particular accelerator in order to ensure the progress for the future. Because see, when we are talking about the multilateralism, one thing is very, very sure, that even the leaders which are talking about that multilateralism is in crisis, nobody says that multilateralism is irrelevant, because this is the time of cooperation and not the conflict. If there is any differences of opinion that emerge between the country, that is better to be resolved through the cooperation or negotiation. There should not be any conflict that emerge, because already world is facing multiple conflict. If the conflict emerges, even world can go towards the third world war if there is any specific spark that comes in the light. So all these things highlights that still the multilateralism is relevant, still the globalization is relevant to the extent it is not discriminating towards the Western world. So the conclusion should be that there should be adequate place that should be provided to the countries of the global south. There should be respect. There should be respect of the territorial sovereignty. There should be respect for the economic sovereignty. Simultaneously, when the demand comes, there should be even the reforms in order to reflect the present global order. And this is the way ahead in the context in order to ensure the sustainable global order, because this is not the time for the conflict. This is the time for the cooperation. So I hope whatever we have discussed regarding this topic of the global crisis and reforms, and regarding the stand towards the future of multilateralism in this particular century is clear to you. I have tried to give you multiple examples, storyline, thought process, data, fact, example, and that will be very, very relevant from the examination perspective also, and from the perspective of one who is just watching these videos in order to get certain information. So we will meet again in the future discussion with respect to certain important and the interesting topics from the international relations perspective. I hope the things are clear to you. Thank you very much.